Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning for this launch of the SDG Alliance here in the European Parliament. I'm speaking to you from Dublin on this Green Week. And of course, Commissioner Gentiloni was here in Dublin earlier this week, and I see he safely returned to Brussels. And we're also joined by Vice President of the European Parliament, Heidi Hautela, and Rebecca Humphries from WWF, who is a Senior Public Affairs Officer. We have an hour, and I would like to make the most use of the hour. So I'm encouraging a contribution of around 5 minutes from each of you to allow time for questions in the Q&A function. So for participants, please submit your questions through the Q&A function. And in particular for MEPs who are members of this SDG Alliance, if you submit a question, we can admit you, your video, so that you can ask the question yourself. So that's to encourage MEPs to take part actively. So today, as I've mentioned, we are launching the SDG Alliance officially during Global Goals Week. This is an informal cross-party group of like-minded MEPs who are passionate about the implementation of the SDGs at the EU framework across EU institutions. It is, of course, universal, and therefore it's important that we have a cross-party and cross-border action on Agenda 2030. Today, we want to do a stock take on where we are in terms of implementing the SDGs, with now less than 10 years to go to 2030. We want to see what the EU can do to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 agenda, including and especially one of the terms of reference for our SDG Alliance is the integration of the SDGs into the European semester, the financing of the SDGs, and the role the European Parliament can play in fulfillment of the 2030 agenda. The context, of course, this week is the General Assembly, which is going on, and Global Goals Week. And for the first time ever, SDG index score has decreased in 2020. And so many human development measures have unfortunately slid backwards. And for the first time since 2015, our path towards zero hunger, unfortunately, has reversed. And it's in that context that the UN Food Systems Summit is taking place. However, this also, one could argue, provides an opportunity. Now that we are emerging, certainly in this part of the world, from the pandemic, the opportunity to use that phrase, build back better, is very real. And we in the Alliance will argue that the SDGs provide a roadmap for recovery across so many public policy headlines. So with that brief introduction, we have a recorded video message from Commissioner Urpilainen. As you know, Commissioner Urpilainen is a Finnish politician. She was the Minister for Finance in Finland. She is now the Commissioner for International Partnerships, a role she has held since December 2019. So let us hear a short video recorded message from Commissioner Urpilainen.
Dear colleagues, I am delighted to address you today for the launch of the Sustainable Development Goal Alliance. Later this week, on 25th September, the calendar will mark 6 years since the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda. Between the global pandemic, social unrest, and recent environmental disasters, the message is clear. We must act now to create a greener, fairer, and more sustainable world. And this means putting the SDGs back on track. That makes this alliance more important than ever. In the spirit of the European consensus to further the Sustainable Development Goals, which was signed by Parliament, the Commission and the Member States, we must collaborate across political lines, branches of government and even national borders. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we collaborated with Member States to mobilise 46 billion euros to support our partner countries. Now we are taking the Team Europe approach a step further. Whether it is eliminating the digital divide, reinvigorating multilateralism, or addressing climate change, together we can have more impact. And our new international financial instrument, SDG Global Europe, will make it easier to turn our collective vision into reality. Colleagues, I congratulate you on creating this alliance, and I look forward to partnering with you to build back better.
40 people. Oh. Thank you very much, Commissioner Urpilainen, for that those introductory remarks. And without any further ado, let me introduce Commissioner Gentiloni. As most of you will know, he has a long and distinguished career in Italian politics, having served as both Minister for Communications and Minister for Foreign Affairs under the cabinets of Mr. Prodi and Mr. Renzi, respectively, before himself becoming Prime Minister of Italy in December 2016. He has been the Commissioner for Economy since December 2019, and he has the very significant responsibility of coordinating the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the European semester cycle of economic governance, which is a particularly important issue. So for that and many reasons, thank you, Commissioner Gentiloni, for joining us, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Honorable Andrews, and thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to participate to this launch event. And as Jutta just reminded us, this happens near to the anniversary of the 2015 adoption of Sustainable Development Goals by the UN Assembly. Of course, this is a good moment, I think, to discuss and reflect on our commitment for SDG, because we are in a perhaps a moment where looking with a longer view to the perspective of our economies is the right thing to do. So we have in front a decade to achieve the SDG, and this should be a decade of action. The moment is a moment where the worst consequences of the pandemic are behind us. Well, we have, of course, still downside risks for our economies, but overall, the outlook is positive. But we know very well that economic activity measured through GDP is only one and very discussed metric of the development. And what we are seeking is not just a rebound in our GDPs. This rebound could be quite near in the EU. We have to look at other dimensions and indicators that are essential to human, social, and environmental well-being. And here we know that the impact of the pandemic is very serious. It is already there because, as you just remembered, in some of the goals, for example, the zero hunger, the impact of the pandemic is already very clearly negative. But these effects could manifest themselves also later on, for example, in the loss of skills, loss of livelihoods, rising inequality, institutional degradation, rise of gender gap. So if we don't act now to keep them at bay, these consequences may well reverse the progress towards the SDGs in Europe. We have been monitoring progress toward the SDGs with our Eurostat monitoring report, and 2021 report showed good progress in reducing poverty and social exclusion, but controversial results both on SDG 13, climate action, and SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, showing that there is a lot to do in these goals. Part of the answer will come for sure from this new and unprecedented effort, common effort that we are having with the Next Generation EU, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the fact that we concentrate investments of this facility in the three aspects: the social inclusion, the digital transition, and number one, the climate transition. This coupled with what we call the Fit for 55, which is the new step towards our European Green Deal, could make part of the effort necessary, especially on SDG 13 and 7, to make progress. But we all know how challenging these goals are. I am quite satisfied on the leading role that the EU and the European Commission and parliaments are having on this, but we also know that the discussion at the global level and also among member states is not an easy one, and rightly so. Second, we had this year the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights in Porto, and I think here also we'll have some step forward for our SDG mission. And finally, and as you remembered, Barry, we decided to mainstream the SDG in the European semester cycle of surveillance. Of course, this will be a gradual process, and also a process that has to be confronted with the special situation that we have in the semester cycle in 2020, 2021, and 2022, because as you know, due to the so-called general escape clause on the semester cycle is, so to say, more broad and less country-specific, quantitatively oriented. But this gives us also the right time to work to this mainstreaming of SDG in the process. Of course, I'll be in conclusion, very clear in saying that it will not be easy, because the tradition is that the EU semester cycle is about fiscal policies. Then we introduced a few years ago the social dimension, and now the reference to the SDG in general. In this work that I commit to do very seriously, we need to discuss with the European Parliament, and we need the support of your new alliance. This support will be crucial in next year. So thank you again for inviting me in this inauguration. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gentiloni. Thank you very much for that, those remarks, and we are delighted to hear your fresh commitment to the SDGs. And we certainly, as an informal cross-party group, will work with you and your staff to advocate for a much greater awareness and implementation. And we hope to have a key debate, an annual report in the European Parliament in the first quarter of 2022, which will hopefully lead into the high-level political forum in the summer of next year, and to make that obviously an annual event. So thank you very much. We would very much look forward to working with you and your with your staff. The next speaker, if I may introduce now, Heidi Hautela, is a Finnish MEP. She is with the European Greens. This is her 5th mandate as an MEP. Previously, she chaired the subcommittee on human rights. And she is, I think, very well known for a legal case that she took, known as the Hautala case, where the European Court of Justice ruled in favor of more access for MEPs to critical documentation. Previously, she was Minister of International Development, so she's huge experience in this area. And as I mentioned earlier, she's Vice President of the European Parliament, first elected in October 2017 and re-elected to this office in 2019. So with that, Heidi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry. And thank you, Commissioner. I think we have come to the point when we realize that the goals are really demanding and compelling, and without means, they mean nothing. And I very much enjoyed the speech of Ursula von der Leyen last week when she was challenging the other major players in the world on climate change, when she said that the EU now has in place what we call Fit for 55, and where are the means of the other regions? So I think it comes very much to now to see that we will put our newly built means to proper use. And I'm thinking of the whole approach of the Green Deal of the Commission, which is now really being mainstreamed to all our activities, including external activities. I need to mention another sort of branch of policy making at the moment, which I think is really going to be key for the implementation of the Agenda 2030, and that is what we're doing in the area of sustainable corporate governance. And Barry, you know very well this work because we are both involved in it. And I think it's time to realize that we will not be able to meet these goals and address the global challenges, achieve our goals, if we don't have the full involvement of the private sector. And I think both in the Green Deal and in sustainable corporate governance, we are a leading force in the world, and we can inspire other regions with our approaches. So I trust that the EU is bigger than it's also reaching out behind its borders, which is really something that obliges us for global responsibility. And just yesterday, the Commission adopted an important instrument for developing countries, the general preferences for customs, GSP, which very much emphasizes on sustainable development, which means that the EU has also an obligation to help developing countries, poorer countries, to put in place the various aspects of sustainable development so that they can satisfy the future markets in the EU, which are more and more demanding in terms of quality and sustainability. So we do have a global responsibility. And I think Commissioner Urpilainen really said something important when she emphasized that the work now needs to go across all borders and all sectors, national, European. We need to come to an integrated approach, I would interpret her words. So, but I do think that the decision to mainstream the SDGs into the European semester is an appropriate one, because that would give us the possibility to have a proper assessment and measurements of where we are. And I'd like to point out to one of our great weaknesses, maybe the biggest weakness, is that it has been found out that there are great spillover effects on sustainable development in the EU countries, which means that we may be able to show that we achieve sustainability in many areas inside the EU, in our domestic activities, European activities, but we do have a huge footprint on the world in terms of excessive consumption of resources, energy, etc., etc. And I hope that when the Eurostat work will also evolve over time, that they will start to take into account these spillover effects. Very concretely, I'm speaking about goal number 12, sustainable production and consumption, which I think is a positive a challenge for the EU, because we can live even better with less consumption of energy and resources and material things. We can produce less waste and be happier. So lastly, perhaps on the role of the European Parliament, and Barry, I'm really happy that you are taking on this steering role in the network. We need to reach out to our counterparts in all parliamentary committees inside the Parliament, and of course working closely with the Commission. And then we will have a great chance to work with our counterparts in national parliaments. And that's why I think we should really appreciate and welcome the role that SDG Watch is taking in this work. So I think concretely speaking, I think we can test our best ideas in this annual report from the European Parliament that you mentioned, Barry, which is to be adopted in the first quarter of 2022. So I hope that this will lead into the EU indeed being able to achieve and meet the global goals that we are committed to achieving. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I know the Commissioner is under extreme time pressure and indicated earlier that he would have to leave before the end. I wonder, Commissioner, would you have time to take one question from one of my MEP colleagues, MEP Kokalis? We can admit his video now if you would like to put the question himself. Petros, are you there to put a question to the Commissioner?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
I can't open my video, but
it's okay.
Okay, thank you. Good morning from me, and I'm very happy to be part of the inauguration. The question, in the interest of time restraints, is very simple. We are very happy that you're going to integrate the impact of SDGs in every policies, but I think it's time to talk about integrating specific targets. We see the SDGs as we see the SDGs which is coordination, and we would like to see you integrating the impact of specific policies of the CAP, of the biodiversity strategy, of the zero pollution strategy, of the forest strategy, in terms of impact on specific measurable targets, even if those are at the level of the Eurostat indicators, which are not always the same as the 170 targets of the SDGs. And also, what is your opinion of the integration of the SDG agenda in the Future of Europe conference? Thank you.
Thank you, Petros. Commissioner, is that did you get that? It was slightly interrupted. Would you be able to answer that question?
I hope so. Yes. Well, the beginning by the end, I think that the conference, being a conference that is based in its essence on the dialogue with citizens and the involvement of stakeholders, parliament, citizens, the SDG and the climate dimension in particular will be crucial in the evolution of the debate. And we are seeing already how this debate is flourishing, and also not easy in several European countries. But I will assure you that the difficulties of the debate will not bring the Commission to downsize our so to say, leading role on climate transition in the next few years, because this leading role is not important only for the impact of our own economies, but it's important because it could be an example for other big players, as it has been in the last year, taking initiatives comparable to the one that the EU and the European Commission announced. As far as the semester is concerned, I think that we will work to reach a steady state where SDG indicators are really integrated in the semester. They are considered in our mechanism of the so-called country-specific recommendations. When I say that this was a gradual process, I was referring to the fact that, of course, I think we should consider two things. The first is the need to upgrade the already very good level of data that Eurostat is providing, with higher frequency on some of the indicators that are crucial for the SDG, and considering also things like the spillover effect that Vice President Hautala was mentioning before. But the target is there. We have numbers. We have numbers on our Green Deal targets. We have numbers on the social pillar, the numbers for employment, number for adults training, and gradually we should arrive in a situation where the reaching or not reaching of these numbers from different member states is a important matter of our fiscal, our economic cycle, and of our country-specific recommendation. It will not happen in a few months, but I think after the period of extraordinary reaction to the pandemic, in the new framework of our economic surveillance, these targets and numbers should become really essential for the economic semester of the Union.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Petros, for your question, and Commissioner for your patience in staying with us. And of course, there are so many of the goals that are shared competences between the EU and member states, which complicates surveillance and implementation. But hopefully this alliance can work towards highlighting those issues where there are exclusive EU competences and where there's no EU competence. And that's why the CSR, the country-specific recommendations, plays such a key role. So, Commissioner, thank you very much for staying with us.
Thank you.
And
I'm sure we will work together on this. Okay.
Yes, much obliged, and thank you, Commissioner. So let us go to our. Thank you. We'll go to our next speaker, and apologies for Rebecca for slightly delaying in coming to you. But Rebecca Humphries has worked in EU policy and advocacy on environmental and sustainable development for WWF in Brussels. She represents here WWF in SDG Watch Europe, and SDG Watch Europe are joining with us today in the SDG Alliance to launch today, and will provide us with advisory support in the work that we do in the Parliament. Rebecca has most recently a master's degree in sustainability leadership from the University of Cambridge. So with that, Rebecca, I will give the floor to you, and apologies again for delay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation to speak at the launch of this SDG Alliance. So as you mentioned, I'm honoured to speak on behalf of SDG Watch Europe today. We're an EU-wide cross-sectoral civil society alliance, bringing together more than 80 members from development, environment, social, human rights, and other sectors, to provide expertise and to hold the EU to account on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And I work, as you mentioned, for WWF European Policy Office, an active member of SDG Watch Europe. So first of all, I'd like to welcome this much needed initiative to launch a cross-party SDG Alliance in the Parliament, and congratulate the MEPs here today who have started this initiative, which I believe will really raise the profile of the importance of the SDGs to EU policymaking in the Parliament. This week also marks 6 years since the SDGs were adopted in New York. We're now in the decade of action towards the SDGs, and we have less than 10 years left to make them a reality, a task that's made harder by the COVID-19 pandemic, which several reports, including the Commission's own annual Eurostat SDG monitoring report, and also the Sustainable Development Report published by the SDSN every year, agree will make it harder to reach our commitments to the SDGs. And this is why we need a new impetus to SDG implementation in the EU, especially when looking at the recent results in those reports. The Eurostat monitoring report presents a very far from positive picture overall in the EU. There's still no sufficient progress on most of the goals, particularly not on goals explicitly tied to the environment, such as Goal 15, Life on Land. And on top of that, as I mentioned, the picture might be even bleaker once we get the full data to take into account the past year and the impacts of COVID-19. And yet the SDGs are a framework which can help us tackle many of the challenges that we are currently facing, from the health crisis to the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, increased inequalities. And the relevance of the SDGs, as Vice President Hautala mentioned, is that they seek to tackle these challenges in an integrated way. One crisis cannot be addressed at the expense of another. And this is important as we really need to consider the drivers in tandem with the impacts. So for example, biodiversity loss, the impact needs to be considered with what's driving it, such as unsustainable consumption and production patterns. The SDGs provide a framework for this kind of systems thinking and policy coherence to be integrated. So in practice, how can the EU make the most of the opportunity that a framework such as the SDGs presents, and how can it build on past achievements to achieve that? Well, these are some of the questions that we hope the SDG Alliance will grapple with. And indeed, there's still much work to be done in the EU. Last year, the Commission published its approach via a staff working document on the SDGs, but we've yet to see some of the commitments truly progress. So the whole of government approach to the SDGs promised by President von der Leyen still needs to be shown in practice. The new ways of engaging with stakeholders that were promised after the end of the EU multi-stakeholder platform on the SDGs still need to be delivered. And we are still waiting for further steps to be taken for the integration of the SDGs into the European semester process. This was put to one side, as Commissioner Gentiloni mentioned, because of the pandemic and the recovery plans, but this is a key commitment of President von der Leyen at the beginning of her mandate, and we're still waiting for this to be done within the semester itself and not only in annexes. The Council in June reiterated the need for the Commission to better clarify how the SDGs will be integrated into the European semester, and further clarify the governance structure and responsibilities of the different commissioners. and also to re-establish a multi-stakeholder platform on the SDGs, to advise the Commission on the implementation of the goals, and to have a structured dialogue with civil society, because we feel that this is missing. And in fact, it's a shame that Commissioner Gentiloni is no longer here to listen to civil society and to have that dialogue. But we're very pleased that now the European Parliament has a dedicated space where committed MEPs can discuss these challenges and drive forward processes where the Parliament can input to other institutions. So we really welcome the plans by the European Parliament to have a report, an annual report on the SDGs. And it's good to hear that this should be ready by next spring to feed into the discussions that will take place at the Stockholm +50 conference next June and the high-level political forum. As SDG Watch Europe, we stand ready to engage with MEPs and share our members' experiences and expertise to help with this important work. So to conclude, I'd just like to say again that there is a real risk that ambitions to achieve the SDGs will be lost because of the pandemic. But to build back better, to use that sentence that you mentioned earlier, Barry, we cannot afford to sideline the SDGs. The 2030 agenda is a common language that's been agreed by the international community, and it provides a framework to achieve a just, socially inclusive recovery while respecting planetary boundaries. So thank you very much for having me on the panel today, and look forward to answering any questions.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for that summary, and thank you to SDG Watch Europe for their support for this initiative. So I thought we might just discuss, begin the discussion. We have a couple of questions that have come in. I'll come to them just now. But one of I'm new to the European Parliament. I'm new to Brussels, really, and I'm still trying to learn exactly where responsibility for the SDGs lie. Now, naturally, Commissioner Gentiloni has specific responsibility in this area. But as I mentioned to him, and I just wanted to share with him my concern around this, is that many of the targets in the goals lie with member states, their member state responsibilities. And some of the targets lie with the European Union, and some of them are shared responsibilities. And as well as that, the responsibility seems to cross over almost every commissioner. And to me, it's a recipe for non-implementation. So we, therefore, as an SDG Alliance here in the European Parliament, need to make a couple of calls around this area. So I'd be interested to hear from either Rebecca or Heidi or both of you as to your impression of that question: who is responsible of integration at member state level and EU level, and what we as parliamentarians can do to address what appears to me to be an obstacle to implementation. Heidi, would you like to give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Barry, for the question. I think it's the best question probably at the moment, because I think many of us were looking for some, let's say, part of the Commission who would really have this overall responsibility. But my thinking is that it has to lie now with the President, because it has been mainstreamed to all Commissioner portfolios. It was in their mission letters. So, and I listened carefully what Rebecca said about the non-continuation of the multi-stakeholder platform. So I have a little bit the feeling that we could help to sort of demand that the President of the Commission will somehow realize that she has also to take a role here, and that there have been commitments which have not been met as the multi-stakeholder platform, which was, I remember, it was a very good way of identifying where the issues for the EU lie. So that's one thing we could do. And then at national level, there are some good practices. I know that the Finnish Committee on Sustainable Development, which is very cross-sectoral, very cross-government, including all kinds of stakeholders from private sector to civil society, it has been mentioned by the Commission as one of the best practices. So there must be others, and maybe we can somehow generate a little bit information about where we think that the good practices are. And let me just mention that I've also noticed that the Court of Auditors has a very dedicated activity on the implementation of Agenda 2030, and at least some time ago, the Swedish member of the court, Eva Lindström, was really vigorously working on this, so we could find out about that. And let me also pay tribute to the European Economic and Social Committee. They have a specific SDG observatory, so we have good practices around, and at least we as a network of MEPs, we could try to sort of bring a little bit all these actors together at the EU level.
Thank you, Heidi. Rebecca, you've been around Brussels for 7 years, I think I read in your bio. So how would you answer that question, or, you know, the Kissinger question, who do you ring in Europe when you want to talk about the SDGs?
Yeah, there is a clear governance gap right now in relation to the SDGs, and it's one of the things that as civil society is the most problematic, because it's also very difficult for us to have those conversations with the Commission. I think, as Heidi mentioned, the President clearly has to be responsible, and in the staff working document that came out last year, it clearly said that she would be responsible for leading this whole of government approach, but the actual steps of how that's being put into practice have not been made clear. And I would say, having followed the SDGs and the implementation in the EU pretty much since they were adopted 6 years ago, one of the things that civil society was always asking for, and that the EU never fulfilled, was the need for an implementation strategy, an overarching implementation strategy. And for me, that's really the fact that never happened is the reason that we're in this this situation right now of not actually knowing who is responsible for what. If we had a clear strategy which had set out which commissioners were responsible for which aspects of the SDGs and who was coordinating the integrated approach, I think we wouldn't be in this situation right now, where it's very difficult to know who to call it or who to speak to when wanting to discuss the SDGs as a whole. So it's often said, the response that we got from the Commission was that another strategy was not needed. There are enough strategies, and but I think what we really need is a clear structure of who is responsible for what. And right now, it also means that there's a lack of accountability when looking at the progress on the goals. So we mentioned the Eurostat report that comes out every year. It's a report that's very broad. It's quite a big report to get through, but it's produced and it shows that there's a lack of progress. But then there is not any action that is tied to that. There's no political response that says, okay, we're not achieving what we need to achieve on these goals, so how are we going to address that? And so there also needs to be some sort of political cycle that is attached to the monitoring of the goals, so that there can be that accountability on SDG implementation.
Yeah, and you reminded us, Rebecca, that the EU did argue for an implementation strategy back in 2015, and it was a missed opportunity, I think, in my view. And those of you who attended the meeting with Professor Sachs will recall his very bleak assessment of where things are in the US. So however bad things are in the European Union, his assessment of where things are in the US was even worse. And I think there's probably, if I could just make my own comment on this, I think there's an opportunity as a sort of a mid-term between 2015 and 2030 in 2023 for a reset and for a high-level political initiative to review, obviously, where we're at, how realistic targets are, the reset of targets, but a fresh political commitment. And as part of the SDG Alliance, it might be worthwhile to examine whether we could look at the presidencies of 2023 and certainly in anticipation of the election of 2024 to push an agenda around resurfacing all of the assumptions behind the Sustainable Development Goals. But that's just a point for discussion as we go along. Let me come to some of the questions then. We've about 10 minutes left. Vince Chadwick from DevEx has a question around debt relief. And there is no doubt that the Debt Sustainability Initiative that runs out in December is a G20 initiative and very linked to achieving the SDGs. Do either of you any comment about this? Should the EU be looking at debt relief initiatives outside of the G20? What about middle income countries who are not captured by the initiative and the enormous debt piles that they have accumulated over the pandemic? Any thoughts on that question from Vince Chadwick, either Heidi or Rebecca? Would either of you like to jump in on that? Heidi, will I go to you?
I don't claim to have a very good or even acceptable answer to this question, but perhaps we should study it, because obviously, as you noted at the beginning of the meeting, that the reversal of the success in implementation has been really hard in the poorer countries. So that's an issue, but let me not go further than that.
Rebecca, any thoughts on that?
Similar to Heidi, I don't have a good response to this question, which I think was also more directed to the commissioner. So it's a shame that he's no longer here to answer it. But it reminds me of a point that was made earlier by Heidi, which I think is really important, which is the spillover effects that we have in the EU, which also needs to be looked at very closely. And I know the Eurostat monitoring report has started to integrate this, but it would be good if this was also considered in the integration of the SDGs into the semester, the impact that we're also having on the achievement of the SDGs by other countries. Because if we're doing great in the EU on the SDGs, but our practices are harming other countries' ability to achieve the SDGs, then we're not actually winning.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Rebecca. The other issue that I wanted to briefly discuss is the concept of sustainable development itself. And I'm a member of the Trade Committee, and when we talk about sustainable development and trying to ensure that our trade agreements are consistent with our ambitions around sustainable development, we are almost always talking about climate and the environment and trying to avoid loss of biodiversity. And somehow or another, sustainable development as a concept is somehow detached from the wider sustainable development goals. So I suppose the complaint, if it's that, is that the climate agenda has almost cannibalized the public policy space that might otherwise have been occupied by the wider sustainable development goals. So climate action, SDG 13, is dominating the public policy space. And it seems to me that there isn't sufficient political will. And I certainly know from the Irish context that that is what has happened at the most senior levels of government. Do either of you have a comment about that? I mean, Heidi, it's a obviously critical question for the European Greens. Has that been is that a fair characterization of what has happened in your mind?
Yeah, this is really interesting because maybe it explains to a part why there's been a bit of a, let's say, I would say that there's been a bit of a silence in the EU policy debates on the SDGs after the, let's say, after 2019 or so, at least. Well, I think it's a dual-edged issue because I think Rebecca mentioned planetary boundaries, and what has puzzled me for a long time is that this notion of the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which was coined in the, I think, in the late 80s by the Norwegian then Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, is that, you know, there's never been a fair sort of judgment on how are these pillars in fact relating to each other. Now I would say that we are in a situation where we have to understand that we have really crossed the planetary boundaries, and that has to do with our spillover effect, which we discussed earlier. So in a way, I think it would be a fair judgment to make that there will be no economy, there will be no society if we don't respect the planetary boundaries, which is the environment pillar. But it needs to be done in the spirit of the whole of government approach that we are all calling for. And how to do that? So I think it's a kind of a yes and no question, that how can we integrate climate and other environmental issues, resource consumption, pollution, toxic substances, to a kind of that we then somehow bring the social and economic dimension into that, so that it's so I would say planetary boundaries is something that we now understand much better than when Gro Harlem Brundtland started. So, but this would be something to have a longer discussion on for sure.
I think you're absolutely right, Heidi. Rebecca, any comments about that? I want to bring in MEP Brickmont, who has a question. Any comments on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, then just very briefly, I'd agree with what's just been said, that it definitely feels like the SDGs have been sidelined in the past couple of years, and I think it's really a shame that this holistic and integrated perspective that we've been talking about, that the SDGs bring, has been sidelined in that way, because I think it harms. Even you were mentioning, Barry, that you feel that the climate agenda is at the sort of at the top of most governments' piles, but losing that holistic perspective can also be harmful to climate action. I think we all know the importance of tackling social and environmental issues in tandem. But also having a policy coherence approach, because if you just look at climate in a very narrow way, but don't take into consideration the impacts that agriculture is having, that bioenergy, that energy policies and harmful subsidies are having on the climate, then that is also not going to actually lead to results that we need there. So it's really a shame that this policy coherence and systems thinking that the SDGs bring has been sidelined.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And we have just time for one more question. If MEP Brickmont is with us, we can admit you're on video there, a colleague of Heidi's, so hopefully not too hard a question. Saskia, if you unmute yourself, there you are.
Yes, I'm connecting. Thank you, Barry. Yes, I just wanted to congratulate you for the launch of the SDGs Global Alliance. I think it's a very important moment, because we know and we all agree that we need to really mainstream SDGs in all all our EU policies, and it has been largely developed today. And I just wanted to share, and I did it in the chat actually, the link to an interesting study that might interest all of you, that refers to the contribution of trade flows to SDGs and their realization. And it's interesting to see that 40% of them contribute positively, but also 60% contribute negatively or are hurdles to their realization. And so it's interesting to see which ones are positively or negatively impacted, and how we can work on these issues through our FTAs, through our economic partnerships. And that's where, as a member of the INTA committee, I will bring my contribution to the Alliance, and I'll be happy to do so, and to work also with you, Barry, with you, Heidi, in INTA committee to work further, because I think there are already many proposals on the table, concrete steps that we can take through the free trade agreements to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Saskia. And I think, yes, next month, Commissioner Reinders will launch his proposal around due diligence, which will be a very significant in trying to reduce the negative impacts of trade that you've outlined, and thank you for sharing that. So if I may just make some concluding remarks, unless either Heidi or Rebecca had anything to say. So just to make some concluding remarks, thank you all of you who've tuned in today for this launch. I think what we should do, and what I'm proposing, is that we would have a closed meeting for members, for MEPs, with SDG Watch on the 27th of October. And I would encourage any MEPs that are tuned in, and any of their assistants that are tuned in, and anybody connected with any MEPs, to get them to join the Alliance. There's a very clear agenda there for us. We have a clear terms of reference, and we need all the cross-party support that we can get. So the 27th of October is what I'm proposing, to let everybody know where we are at, in particular trying to get that annual report done by Q1 of next year. And then touching on that question of the annual report, there will be, this matter will be raised at the DEVA and ENVI coordinators meetings on Monday the 27th of September, that's next Monday, and Wednesday the 29th of September, respectively. So DEVA on the 27th of September and ENVI on the 29th of September. So again, I would encourage MEPs and their assistants to encourage their members to support this initiative at the coordinators meetings that are taking place next week. So that is it. It is now 11 o'clock. I think we've crammed a lot of into the very brief time. Olive Towie, just to say thank you, Olive, for your support, and she offers her congratulations for the initiative. I want to thank particularly Rebecca and SDG Watch Europe and WWF for their support and their advice, and I hope that we will work together. Thank you, Heidi, very much for all of your support and your contribution today, and thank you everybody for